Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Santapietro, the Government Relations Liaison here at the MAHA Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to our 5th roundtable event entitled Weaponization of Science, Flaws in Fraud and Research here at the historic Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. MAHA Institute is a U.S. think tank focused on reforming the political, regulatory, and legislative environment to end corporate capture of government and restore its focus on the health of the American people. These roundtables are regular public events to facilitate dialogue between advocates, policymakers, and subject matter experts, so be sure to subscribe on our website to stay up to date on future events. While Secretary Kennedy, President Trump, and a new generation of public health officials are bringing a transformative culture of transparency to our top scientific agencies, much of the scientific establishment, whose role is to deliver truthful information to the public, continues to operate in an environment of corporate and ideological influence which misleads medical providers and distorts health outcomes. Due to decades of corruption and stagnation, biomedical research is replete now with conflicts of interest, industry influence, perverse incentives, ideological capture, narrow-mindedness, irreproducible findings, and outright frauds. Today's roundtable will explore how biomedical research became a swamp of corruption and how new patterns of information delivery can help revitalize and revolutionize trust in science and the practice of medicine. 5.5 years ago, a novel genome assembled in the Wuhan lab rapidly morphed into a global assault on liberty, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, bodily autonomy, logic, reason, and the scientific method itself. The frauds and lies of the COVID era were as numerous as they were destructive, from faulty nucleotide and protein assays, absurdly unscientific and fear-inducing mask mandates, anti-social distancing, lockdowns, shuttering of churches, schools, and small businesses, while big box stores and liquor stores stayed open, and then, of course, the shots. And second and third order effects, like supply chain disruption, persistent inflation, unemployment, splitting of families and friend groups, something we've probably all experienced, demographic dislocation, and education disruption made permanent impacts on the trajectory of human history. At no period of time is it more obvious that America was fully in the grips of the scientific industrial complex that President Eisenhower prophetically warned about in his farewell address. But as bad as this period was, the decline in scientific integrity preceded the COVID era. For decades, too many experts have been peddling poorly established theories as fact for both commercial and political ends. The demonization of cholesterol and replacement of saturated fat with seed oils, the serotonin theory of depression, the explosion of the childhood vaccine schedule, the amyloid plaque theory of Alzheimer's, wherein billions of dollars were wasted based on photoshopped Western blots. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, remember her? Avoidance of sunlight, Vioxx, OxyContin as a non-addictive painkiller, a particularly insidious and deadly lie that ravaged rural America and the working class. And more recently, The Lancet and Surgisphere's attack on hydroxychloroquine, promotion of asymptomatic transmission and sterilizing respiratory immunity, safe and effective, the list goes on and on. And each time that these disastrous frauds are revealed, without swift and thorough delivery of justice, the corruption and degeneration of the scientific enterprise continues. The result of these frauds and the collapse of public trust in science can be seen with the naked eye. Epidemic levels of obesity, chronic disease, inflammation, anxiety and depression, ADHD and ASD, endocrine disruption, androgyny, infertility, increasing youth cancer rates. Americans are now the sickest and most medicated we've ever been, all while the sick care industry makes up the largest share of U.S. gross domestic product, now nearly $5 trillion in annual spending. Meanwhile, the bureaucratization and ideological capture of academia has throttled the critical thinking necessary to drive scientific progress and created a toxic environment of self-censorship, ego-driven skirmishes, and deeply ingrained cynicism. One of the things we'd like to accomplish with today's event is to give the countless number of well-intentioned but frustrated scientists who we know are out there the courage to speak up and reform their institutions from within. We're very fortunate to have several such scientists here with us today, and it's our hope that their courageous testimony will inspire thousands of their colleagues to follow suit in the coming months and years. Now, scientists get things wrong all the time, and such innocent errors and failed hypotheses are a constant and, in fact, necessary reality of scientific pursuits. If an idea can't be wrong, then it can't be science. And as the great physicist Richard Feynman once said, Science is a belief in the ignorance of the experts. Science and medicine, as materialistic human ventures, are not intrinsically good or evil. These critical disciplines should be analyzed and conducted with the minimum possible amount of material, egotistical, financial, or ideological attachments. Our goal with this and future efforts is not to undermine science, but to rescue it from the commercial, bureaucratic, and political forces which have severed it from its purpose and potential. We are inspired to develop today's roundtable precisely because we hold such a deep appreciation for the scientific method and its fruits, how it's freed us from the Hobbesian existence of our ancestors and delivered unprecedented levels of comfort and prosperity to the human race. But in the wake of so many frauds, no amount of gaslighting or sophisticated propaganda campaigns will be able to restore the public's faith in the scientific enterprise. Nothing short of an aggressive and thorough restructuring will suffice, and it's our desire that today's event can advance the honest and difficult public dialogue that must occur to arrest this tailspin of scientific credibility. MAHA is an opportunity for patriotic Americans of all stripes, scientists, medical practitioners, patients, journalists, analysts, advocates, students, and instructors to finally break themselves free of the restrictive and demoralizing institutions that have failed us, and from the archaic left-to-right dialectic which has exhausted our political culture. MAHA is a generational movement for all people of goodwill to come together and build new systems that allow for flourishing of sincere scientific inquiry and open debate that can propel the United States into the happier and healthier future that our children deserve. Science, like history, is never settled and never finished. Thank you all once again for joining us today, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Chris Masterjohn. Chris Masterjohn, PhD, believes mitochondrial dysfunction is the hidden epidemic behind modern disease, and that idiosyncratic genetic bottlenecks in energy metabolism are the key to understanding how each of us can maximize our own potential. A PhD in nutritional sciences, former professor and leading mitochondrial health expert, Chris spent years researching mitochondrial biology before founding the world's first mitochondrial analysis, mito.me. His work reveals that mitochondrial testing, once thought to be only relevant to rare diseases, can uncover key actionable insights about how each person can best advance their own health. Chris's mission is to bring mitochondrial testing out of the rare disease space and into everyday health, helping people identify and fix the specific energy bottlenecks holding them back. As an outspoken opponent of COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates, Chris is honored to take part in the MAHA Renaissance. Chris.
In 2016, Professor John Ioannidis of the Stanford School of Medicine wrote a paper called Evidence-Based Medicine Has Been Hijacked. And to quote from this paper, here's a brief synopsis of how it's been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry. The industry, he wrote, runs a large share of the most influential randomized trials. They do them very well. They score better on quality checklists, and they are more prompt than non-industry trials to post and publish results. Sounds great so far. To continue to quote, it's just that they often ask the wrong questions with the wrong short-term surrogate outcomes, the wrong analyses, the wrong criteria for success, and they make the wrong inferences, end quote. In short, the pharmaceutical industry has the resources to ask the questions in the best conceivable way possible, but it asks all the wrong questions. And I would add that the way in which it does this creates a system of smoke and mirrors that has even fooled people like John Ioannidis himself, who at the current time believes that COVID vaccines have saved millions of lives. And I want to give as the prime example, supporting the general framework that Ioannidis offered in terms of how the pharmaceutical industry has captured the randomized trials, an analysis of the test negative design. Now, I think a lot of people in the MAHA movement understand the importance of using saline controls in placebo-controlled trials of vaccines, which is not usually done. That's one important point, but I would like to bring up a whole other point that I think is much less appreciated, but just as extremely important. Okay, so in October 2021, the CDC comes out with a headline that says, use of an mRNA booster shot is associated with a 95% decreased risk of COVID-19 associated hospitalizations. Now, literally everyone who hears this headline thinks that what this means is that if you've gotten the shot and then you get COVID, you have a 95% decreased risk of winding up in the hospital. But the key smoke and mirror part of this headline is that the operative word is not hospitalization, it's COVID-19 associated. So what was the design of this study that produced that headline? They went to the hospital and they found thousands of people who were hospitalized for COVID-like illness. And what that meant was that they had respiratory failure, they had pneumonia, they had trouble breathing, they had fever, they had vomiting, or they had diarrhea. Now, usually some combination of those things. Now, keep in mind, this is October 2021, right? So they're going into the hospital. You assume at this time, imagine yourself back in October 21. If you think people are in the hospital for respiratory failure, you think they have COVID, right? That's what everyone thought. Okay, so they go in there and they say, okay, assume you all have COVID-like illness and you're in the hospital. These are the only people in the study had all these symptoms and were hospitalized. Now let's test you for COVID and let's see if you've gotten the COVID vaccine. And it turns out that the people hospitalized for respiratory failure were 95% decreased likelihood of testing positive for COVID. Okay, so the headline makes you think that if you have the shot and you get COVID, you're 95% likely to not wind up in the hospital. What the headline actually means is that if you're in the hospital and you're dying of something that looks like COVID, having gotten the shot will make you 95% less likely to test positive for COVID. But why do you care if you test positive for COVID if you're dying of respiratory failure in the hospital? Okay, now another secret that came out of this was that 94.4% of the people who were in the hospital with the COVID-like illness in October 2021 tested negative for COVID. So one big secret that was buried in that paper was that we had a pandemic of COVID-negative, COVID-like illness in the hospital. All right, now there was a study in February of 2022 that came out that showed that half to 2/3 of these people actually did have COVID. You can tell that based on their antibody exposure. And so it does seem like there's something about the vaccine that makes you more likely to get sick, but less likely to test positive for COVID. And that's probably related to the inflammatory response that it creates that can both make you sick, but also clear the virus from your nose. But I want to bring this back to the rest of the vaccine studies. So first of all, this is called a test negative case control study, is what this is called. 90% of vaccine efficacy studies are test negative design case control studies. And one particularly egregious example of these is the polio studies. So the current polio vaccine that's used in the developing world is tested exclusively using this design. And what they do is they go to places like India, Nigeria, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. They find tens of thousands of people, of children, who are paralyzed with acute flaccid paralysis, which is the type of paralysis that you get from polio. And the design of the study is to enroll tens of thousands of children who are all paralyzed with polio-like paralysis, and then test their stool for type 1, type 2, and type 3 poliovirus. And the vaccine itself can give you type 2 poliovirus, so they exclude the children that test positive for that. And they ask the question, among the paralyzed children, is the vaccine likely to decrease your risk of testing positive for type 1 or type 3 wild poliovirus in your stool? And what they conclude is that the vaccine is incredibly effective in paralyzed children of decreasing the likelihood of testing positive for polio. But you have to ask the question, if you're a parent of that child or you're the child, why do you care if you test positive for polio if you have the same paralysis? So I think this is the most egregious type of asking the wrong question, but this also permeates all the COVID vaccine trials. Now, the design of every COVID vaccine trial was, we're going to give you a kit at the beginning of the trial. You're going to take it home with you. If you think you have COVID, you're going to ask for a telemedicine conference, and then if our doctor agrees you have COVID, you're going to test yourself with the kit and send it back. And so when they first came out with the 2-month Pfizer results, and they said it was 95% effective against COVID, what we learned from the FDA briefing documents around the EUA that was given out in December 2020 was that 95% of the people who thought they had COVID didn't have COVID, but they were effectively eliminated from the study. So what you're seeing is the same thing. The vaccine was tested for its ability to give you a negative test when you were just as sick. Okay, so I think what we need to learn from this is that we need, as a society, from FDA, from the scientific journals, from every relevant stakeholder, we need to pressure us not just to be using good controls. We need to be looking at total mortality as the ultimate endpoint. We need to be looking at the total morbidity of the disease category as a major secondary endpoint. In other words, it's much more likely whether a vaccine is decreasing your likelihood of getting sick with a respiratory illness or winding up in the hospital from it than it is whether it's affecting some test that you get when you are that sick. And I think you could look at other examples in pharma, but they're not as egregious as this. So as an example, if you look at cholesterol-lowering statin drugs, you can have lots of questions on the trials and the endpoints that they use, but they don't do it anywhere near as bad as the vaccine trials. What I just gave you about the vaccine trials is as if a statin trial was showing that there was no difference in heart disease or heart attacks, but it did lower your cholesterol, and then they came out with a headline that said, Lipitor is 95% effective at reducing cholesterol-associated heart attacks. And they don't do that, it's not that bad. But nevertheless, there are questions. For example, if we take the idea of looking at all-cause mortality or total mortality, can we look at that instead of disease substitution? A lot of these trials, they're showing we get a little bit less of one disease, but we're just getting a little bit more of another, and so on. And we could look at SSRIs. A major problem with the SSRI trials is the question being asked is, what is the effect of this drug over the course of 12 weeks? But in clinical use, they're prescribing them for 5 years or longer. And what you see is that these short-term trials can show very low risks of withdrawal, but when you look at the surveys of people who have been on them for 5 to 8 years, you have catastrophic levels of withdrawal when they try to go off those drugs. Now, I think if we're asking the question, how are we going to change the questions that are asked? I think we need to see this from all levels. We need to see it from the academic institutions, we need to see it from the editors of the journals, we need to see it from the peer reviewers, we need to see it from the regulators. But I think if you look at the landscape now, the people who want to change the questions being asked don't have any power in most of those areas, and we, in the MAHA movement, we are the only people that want to change the answers to those questions. So I do think we need our leaders to use the bully pulpit for this, but I also think we need to radically transform the FDA, and one of the things the FDA needs to do is to push the use of the right questions. But I also think that, if you look at, and I know we have allies in a lot of areas, I think we need to bring in the people that want to see innovation, along with people that want to see the use of the precautionary principle, and along scientists like me who want to see the right questions being asked. And we need to change the FDA so that we have
less of a large authority structure that determines the truth for people to consume, and we have to make it a much more open clearinghouse of information. So I think a modern FDA in modern society using modern tools makes every type of stakeholder, whether you are a public health advocate, or you're a regulator, or you are a scientist, and so on, allows us to register as the type of stakeholder we are on the FDA website, and allows a multiplicity of scientific opinions and layman's translations for public consumption to be rated and voted on by the large aggregate of different types of stakeholders, so we can really get transparency to the consumer, such as, this layman's description is endorsed by X amount of public health advocates and X amount of scientists, etc. But we can all certainly agree that we need to be asking much better questions, so I hope that as the panels get going, we get a good handle by the end of the day on the types of questions we should be asking. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Our next speaker is Mark Skidmore, Professor of Economics and Agricultural Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Dr. Skidmore holds the Morris Chair in State and Local Government Finance and Policy at Michigan State and is a distinguished scholar at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. He's also served as director of the USDA-funded North Central Regional Center for Rural Development from 2016 to 2020, and as co-editor of the Journal of Urban Affairs from 2011 to 2021. Professor Skidmore's research covers topics in urban regional economics, public finance and policy, disasters and health, including COVID-19. He's published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and edited 3 books. He's received more than $10 million in grant funding from the National Science Foundation, Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of Agriculture, among other organizations. In recent years, Professor Skidmore has published 3 articles relating to COVID-19, one of which examined the potential scale of COVID-19 vaccine adverse events. That 2023 article, originally published in the BMC Infectious Diseases, indicated that those who observed adverse events among family and friends were much less likely to be inoculated. The evaluation also indicated that as many as 278,000 people may have died from the COVID vaccine in the first year of its rollout. The article was improperly retracted, taking Dr. Skidmore on a journey into the world of weaponized retractions. Please welcome Dr. Skidmore.
Thank you, Justin. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. And Chris, I couldn't help but smile at some of your illustrations of these things, and you think to yourself, how could a legitimate scientist just go along with these frameworks that are put before us? And I think that's an important question to ask. But we do live in an ecosystem where there's this built-in self-monitoring, and of course we know that capture is a part of all of that. You can imagine any culture has something that we define as reality. Some of reality is true, and some of our reality is not true. And a lot of what is not true is curated through capture. We have lots of things that people believe are true that just aren't true, and it's sometimes very difficult to sort through all of that. So that capture spans not just government entities, but business, media, social media, universities potentially, scientific journals, all the way down to individuals. At the university level, 55% of funding comes from federal government organizations for R&D. Increasingly, they rely on public-private partnerships and reliance on foundations. And all of these entities have their vested interests. And some of them, you could argue, are captured. And so that trickles down to the university and on down to the researcher. And so the researcher is faced with this struggle because they know the costs and benefits, and do I do something over here that might be useful or maybe not useful, but it's funded, or do I do something that's risky and maybe not funded? And so people tend to move. I think the most common thing that happens at the university is that important topics don't get studied, and we don't know how big a lot cost that is to society. Because sometimes, as we'll discuss today, we have fraudulent research that may appear, or we might not report unwelcome findings because the funder doesn't go along with what the funder says, as so nicely illustrated in the new movie Inconvenient Truth. Scientific journals and editors also have pressures and may have conflicts of interest. I think most suppression occurs at the editor's desk. If the editor is risk averse, they'll just reject the controversial stuff. So most of that stuff happens there. Every once in a while an article will get through and it might get improperly retracted, which I'm going to talk about in my case. To illustrate some of the complications and interrelatedness of organizations, let me talk about the journal BMC Infectious Diseases. That was the journal that published my article and then retracted it. It is published under a family of journals managed by BMC, which in turn it falls under Springer Nature. Springer Nature is in turn controlled by Holtzbrink Publishing Group, which is a partner of the World Economic Forum. Albert Bourla and Bill Gates are prominent influencers and regularly attend those events. So you can see all the linkages through there. So that's a challenge for us all. I want to spend the remainder of my time just giving a concrete illustration of how a retraction works and how it appears to be coordinated. I'm going to give you a timeline of what happened to me with key events, and they seem to be coordinated, but I don't know. I'll leave it to you to be the judge. On January 24th of 23, my article was published, and it went viral on social media. On January 27th, the journal editor contacts me and says they're going to conduct a re-review of the article. On February 21st, it was alleged that I had engaged in ethical misconduct. My University Institutional Review Board then has to conduct an investigation, whether they want to or not, right? It's their job. On February 28th, my university lifts the COVID vaccine mandate, and I wonder if the revelation of my study had anything to do with that. They were one of the first universities to lift the mandate, and it was months before the federal public health emergency was lifted by the government. On March 30th, my university announced that Anthony Fauci would receive an honorary doctorate and serve as graduation keynote speaker. On April 11th, the journal formally retracts the article, and on April 12th, my Wikipedia page was revamped to indicate the retraction and make a note that I'm anti-vax. And at this point, I hadn't really even looked at the other vaccines. I knew very little about it. In early April, the Chronicle of Higher Education and the LA Times wrote hit pieces about the article, but I think it's also important to put into question the integrity of the researcher as well. So that was all happening at the same time. On May 5th, Dr. Fauci receives his honorary doctorate, and I was in attendance, and as I recall, he included in his speech a warning about COVID misinformation. On September 13th, the Institutional Review Board at my university determined that I had not violated any ethical standards. No updates in the media about that, though. And then in October, after another round of peer review, the article was republished in the journal Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law. So, I won't tell you that it wasn't stressful. It was stressful for me and my family. But I have to say, I don't think I lost a lot of sleep over it because I felt like I was just doing what I was supposed to do. My job is to ask a question I think is important and then try to shed light on it. I never indicated that it was the answer to the work, but indicated it was a signal and it called for more research. We know that there's a lack of transparency and there are conflicts of interest in many arenas. And it's our job to continue to do what we can to eliminate those. But I think it's difficult to distinguish who the really bad actors are. Sometimes you can clearly say who they are, and sometimes not. But there are a lot of people who are also just influenced by propaganda. We all live in this environment, and it's a challenge. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, "To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he is doing is good, or else it's a well-considered act of conformity with natural law." I think this is true. Otherwise, who would purposely administer a toxic COVID shot? Who would give a sick patient a toxic drug like remdesivir? Who would withhold effective COVID treatments if they didn't think they were trying to do the right thing? And then I'll close with another quote by one of my favorite Russian authors, Fyodor Dostoevsky. "Nothing in this world is harder than speaking the truth." At a tremendous cost, I might add.
Thank you, Dr. Skidmore. Our next speaker is Paul Thacker, an investigative journalist who runs the Disinformation Chronicle. He has spent the last 2 decades uncovering campaigns to distort science and has written for the New York Times, JAMA, Washington Post, New England Journal of Medicine, LA Times, New Republic, Mother Jones, Unheard, and Real Clear Investigations. Thacker won the 2021 British Journalism Award for a series in the BMJ that investigated the financial interests of medical experts advising US and UK government during the COVID-19 pandemic. A separate investigation he wrote for the BMJ looked at problems in the clinical trial for Pfizer's vaccine. That article was the finalist for an Investigative Journalism Award and is the most highly viewed article in all of science in 2021. For several years, Thacker led a series of high-profile investigations in the US Senate, examining corruption in science and medicine. This work led to reforms in medicine, including passage of the Physician Payments Sunshine Act and improved conflict of interest policies at the National Institutes of Health. Paul?
Thank you so much. So I was kind of excited to come here because I live in Spain, but it was fun to come here to DC, but to this particular venue because I was here 15 years ago for a Christmas party that was hosted by the, make sure I get this correct, because there's so many different groups in DC, the American Association of Medical Colleges. And I'll read to you, I just looked up to see, how do they position themselves? And what they say that they are is they're transforming healthcare through innovative medical education. So they sound very think tanky, very intellectual, but here's who they really are. They're the lobbyists for the medical colleges. And they had me here for the Christmas party because they were lobbying me. Because at the time, I was an investigator in the United States Senate, and I was beating to death all their dues-paying members. We had realized that we had serious problems with the influence of the pharmaceutical and medical device industries on medicine. And we were trying to figure out, how do we get at this? How do we try and stop some of this from happening? And we were in my boss's office one day, the chief of investigations for the Senate Finance Committee, and she was putting down on a legal pad how all the money went around. You have money coming from pharma, and it goes to the colleges, and then it goes to pays the professors off. Then you see those professors end up on the FDA panels, and then you see money going from pharma, and it goes to pay for their education. And so we had a schematic going, and I just slowed it all down. I said, well, look, we can't stop corporations from making money because that's the definition of what corporations are for. They were found specifically, how do you make money? You put money in, you want to get money back, right? That's what investors give money to corporations for. So we can't stop corporations from behaving like capitalists. That's what they exist for. But we do have an idea that doctors are supposed to be there for patients, so why don't we focus on doctors? And this is one of the problems you have. When you have a very complex system, you can't chase everything. You have to focus on one node. And how can you slow everything down? So we're trying to slow all this money down by focusing on the doctors. Why? The doctors are the ones who sit on the panels that approve the products, right, at the FDA. They're the ones who go out and give the talks at the big conferences. They get all the other doctors to go and prescribe this drug more, or do this treatment more. So why don't we expose their money? And so what I had done is, I got a list of who people felt were some of the most corrupt physicians in America, and we sent letters to their universities and said, please turn over all the money this guy has disclosed. There was a couple women, mostly guys, disclosed for taking from industry. And then what I did was, I found out who the top pharmaceutical companies were in America, and I sent letters to them, and I said, tell us how much money you paid these guys. And then we just mixed and matched. You might be shocked to learn this, but like, they weren't telling how much money they were really getting, right? They were lying at times. I remember, so I made charts. I remember one time we had a second-year law student from Georgetown who was interning, and I put a chart like, here's how much money you said you took. Here's how much money they say they paid for you. She's like, just send that, and then like in 55 font, like WTF, And so we just kept doing it over and over again, and rolling out and hitting them over and over again. Harvard University, Emory University, University of Minnesota, U of Texas, Stanford. Wherever I looked, there was just a bunch of money that was never being reported. And they were disclosing to the universities as they were required. One of the top guys that put him on the front page of the New York Times, great piece of real estate, was Charlie Nemeroff, who was chair of psychiatry at Emory University. So when I'm invited to this conference, right, I knew what this is really about. When I was invited here to this Christmas party, and I said, by the way, it's really great to get invited to a Christmas party here, because then if you're dating someone, which I was, then you can have her show up. She has to dress up. She really likes you then, because like, you can take her to a really nice party. She has to dress up good. So what they're doing is they're doing like The Godfather, right? Friends closer, enemies closer. So I show up, and it was really nice. Really great place for Christmas. The other place I went to that year was Greenpeace, which is like a very different venue. Beer and kegs, dudes smoking weed like on the back staircase, totally different environment than here. And the guy who was president of the AAMC, we spoke for a while, and his wife started talking to me. This woman, like, I don't know, because I'm a man, I don't know, but like, somebody just looking at me tell, like, that's a really expensive dress. I don't know how much it was, but you can just tell, like, that's a lot of money right there. And she looks at me, she starts talking about Charlie Nemeroff, who was chair of psychiatry at Emory, who by this time, I pushed him out of Emory. Emory's president had flown up to DC to talk to us. Like, you got a corrupt guy, what are you gonna do? Did not go well for them. I kept putting him in the media over and over again with how corrupt he was. And she looks at me and she says, I just want to let you know that I'm a psychiatrist, and we always knew that Charlie was corrupt. So we're like bonding, right? But we're not bonding. So I'm just like, why the hell didn't you do anything? Why'd you wait for me to fix your problems? That's how it worked. So, but the process of what we were trying to do was, I was placing these guys in the media with corruption everywhere. Again, Harvard, Emory, University of Minnesota, University of Texas, Stanford, right? Because we were making the case that we didn't have, what they always say is like, oh, there's a couple of rotten apples. You don't have a rotten apple, you have a rotten barrel. And this corruption is endemic throughout medicine. So what did we get out of this? Well, as I was doing this, we were pushing a bill, the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which required the companies to begin reporting how much money they were paying to doctors, because we knew that doctors weren't telling us the truth. So now we're going to have the companies tell us directly. So you can look that up now. You can go and look up any physician in America through the Open Payments website, and you can see who's paying them and how much money they're getting and what the payments were for. You'd be shocked to know that, like, when Biden picked the woman to run the NIH, she'd taken just so much money from Pfizer. It came out. You can look that up on the website. So, but did this really, solve everything? No, we know it didn't, right? Because what came next? We had the opioid, pandemic, which we didn't talk about there, epidemic in America, which we didn't talk about that much because it was being overshadowed by COVID. So it didn't fix all the problems, but it does help, right? That you have something in place to try and change the process. And this is the thing that I think is very important. Sometimes I don't always see with people in this MAHA movement. Stop trying to fix problems and change the process, right? What we did by requiring the companies to report this money, we did it because this was the second scandal we dealt with. We dealt with Vioxx, right? Vioxx was this drug that came on the market and we found out it was terrible. We started looking at, like, how did this drug get approved? Well, look at the FDA panel that approved it. All these guys have ties to the industry. Then along came Weaponization, the best-selling diabetes drug on the planet. Surprise, a bunch of guys taking money from GlaxoSmithKline. You know, so we weren't trying to fix the problem of Vioxx. We weren't trying to fix the problem of Weaponization. We were trying to fix the problem of how these drugs get on the market. So that's the thing that I think is really important to understand. Don't try and fix a problem, try and change the process. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Paul. Our next speaker is Marianne DeMasi. Marianne DeMasi, PhD, is an award-winning investigative journalist from Australia. For more than a decade, she worked as a filmmaker and television presenter for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and has received 3 National Press Club Awards for excellence in health journalism. Dr. DeMasi is renowned for her investigations into the chemical, medical, food, and pharmaceutical industries, and for raising awareness of the harms of overdiagnosis and unnecessary treatments. She's written for The Guardian and Huffington Post and produces investigative reports for the BMJ. She also lectures internationally on topics such as scientific bias and censorship, conflicts of interest, and flaws in clinical research. She holds a PhD in rheumatology from the University of Adelaide and has served as a speechwriter and policy advisor to the South Australian Minister for Science and Information Technology. Her work appears on Substack under Marianne DeMasi Reports, and she can be found on X at Marianne DeMasi. Please welcome Marianne.
Thank you, Justin. So in today's panel on the weaponization of science, I will be discussing how science itself has become distorted and manipulated, and how it's often used as a tool to control the narrative. And I've seen this play out in my career, how evidence is produced. It's not really just a few bad actors. It's an entire system that's built on commercial interests. And once you start to pull the thread and you look at who funds the research, who controls the data, and who polices the outcomes, you quickly realize that the corruption of science is structural and systemic. My first encounter with this was back in 2013 when I produced an Australian documentary that questioned the overprescription of medications called statins. These are the most widely prescribed cholesterol-lowering medications in the world. Now, the reaction to that documentary was extraordinary. The pharmaceutical industry was outraged. The program was censored despite an internal investigation finding no factual errors, and I was publicly attacked. No one actually criticized or addressed the evidence in the program. They just simply tried to shut it down. I kept digging, and in 2018 I published a journal article called Statin Wars, Have We Been Misled by the Evidence? And in that piece I revealed that all of the raw data that underpins the major clinical trials for statins is actually held by a single group in Oxford called the Cholesterol Treatment Trialists. Now, this group has struck a deal with the statin manufacturers and agreed to never share the raw data with outside researchers. So we now have a situation where the trials that underpin statins have never been independently scrutinized by outside researchers, despite the fact that millions of people are taking this drug. The vast majority of statin trials are funded by the manufacturers themselves, and virtually all of them show benefit. There is one publicly funded clinical trial on statins which showed no benefit, so it becomes evidently clear that who funds the trials matters. When manufacturers fund their own trials, they get to mark their own homework, and they can use techniques to amplify the benefits and minimize the harms. For example, they can use run-in periods to weed out people who can't tolerate the drug before the trial, and then during the trial, it becomes evident that the harms are grossly underestimated. They might also report the benefits of the drug in relative rather than absolute terms, which seems to exaggerate the benefit, which in reality is minuscule for the patient at the individual level. I'm also concerned about regulatory capture and the illusion of oversight of our medications. In 2022, I conducted an investigation for the BMJ where I looked at 6 of the major international drug regulators and found that all of them largely accepted industry fees, or largely are operative. They're largely funded by the drug industry that they're supposed to regulate. In Australia, my native country, the Therapeutic Goods Administration gets 96% of its funding from industry fees, and over 90% of new drug applications are given the green light. In the US, it's a similar situation. The FDA collects user fees, millions of dollars in user fees, which now fund about 2/3 of its drug review budget, which scholars have called institutional corruption. And I agree, that's exactly what it is, because the industry money drives the demand for faster approvals through these expedited pathways. In my BMJ investigation, I found that almost 70% of new drug applications at the FDA are approved by these expedited pathways. And they say it's in the name of efficiency, but often these pathways mean that drugs are approved on weaker evidence, shorter trials, and looser post-marketing obligations. It also means that these drugs are more likely to have safety issues once they enter the market, or more likely to be labelled with a black box warning. A more recent investigation on over 400 FDA approvals over a 10-year period found that 73% of drugs approved by the FDA failed to meet the most basic criteria for proving that they were even effective. I've also reported on how medical journals, as we've heard today, play a role in this deception. The BMJ's Peter Doshi investigated a popular anti-clotting drug called ticagrelor. In the pivotal Plato trial, which was the trial that the drug was approved, he found major irregularities and unexplained deaths. When he took it to the journal, Circulation, they ignored his concerns, and to this day, the journal refuses to investigate these irregularities. Meanwhile, smaller studies that challenge powerful interests are swiftly retracted. In India, for example, researchers published a peer-reviewed study on Covaxin, which is a COVID-19 vaccine, and that found that serious adverse events after vaccination were not uncommon. The manufacturer of that vaccine retaliated by suing the authors for defamation. They pressured the journal to retract the study, which they did, despite finding no fraud or fabrication. Even fact-checking has become a weapon in science. I reported on this one instance where a peer-reviewed journal from Japanese researchers reported a statistically significant rise in certain types of cancers following the COVID-19 mRNA rollout. The authors made no claim of causation. They simply called for further investigation. But after a Reuters fact check, it spooked the journal and they immediately retracted the paper. The weaponization of science isn't just about suppressing ideas and inconvenient studies. It's about punishing the scientists who don't fall into line. During the Vioxx scandal, internal Merck emails revealed that the company literally held a hit list of doctors who criticised their drug. The executives wrote that they would, quote, seek them out and destroy them where they live. So it's become just too dangerous to challenge the scientific narrative. When companies conceal harms, they pay fines and then they move on. After Vioxx, which was linked to tens of thousands of deaths, not one executive went to jail. So what's the solution? I think if we're serious about restoring trust, the executives who knowingly hide or market unsafe drugs should face criminal penalties, not just corporate fines, because fines are not enough of a deterrent. I think regulators must also be rebuilt, publicly funded, insulated from corporate money, and supported by genuine political will. Finally, we need to revive the principle that science is not about consensus, it's about contestability. If we can't test claims, challenge data, or uncomfortable questions without fear, then we no longer have science, we have marketing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Our next speaker is Brian Hooker, PhD. Brian is the Chief Scientific Officer at Children's Health Defense, an organization committed to the best health for children in the U.S. and worldwide. He's also an emeritus professor of biology at Simpson University in Redding, California, where he specialized in microbiology and biotechnology. Dr. Hooker has many accomplishments to his credit, including co-inventor for 5 patents, recipient of the Patel Entrepreneurial Award in 2001, and a Federal Laboratory Consortium Recognition Award in 1999 for his work on reactive transport in 3 dimensions. The breadth of Dr. Hooker's over 80 science and engineering papers have been published in internationally recognized peer-reviewed journals. His most recent publications focus on the epidemiology of vaccine adverse events. Dr. Hooker has been active in the vaccine safety world since 2001 and has a 27-year-old son who sustained severe injuries from his infant vaccines. In 2013 and 2014, Dr. Hooker worked with the CDC whistleblower, Dr. William Thompson, to expose fraud and corruption within the vaccine safety research in the CDC, which led to the release of over 10,000 pages of documents. Please welcome Dr. Brian.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I usually wing it, so this is kind of weird, but we'll go ahead and do prepared remarks. After my son's vaccine injury in 1999, I started investigating the role that vaccines played in causing autism, and was very interested in the research at the CDC regarding the connection between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism, as well as the MMR vaccine and autism. By 2001, I was directly contacting CDC epidemiologists in charge of these studies, and very quickly noticed that any questions I had regarding methodologies that were employed, or preliminary results that they were obtaining, these questions were brusquely blown off with non-answers and extremely unscientific statements. In my first encounter, this was back in about 2003, with CDC whistleblower Dr. William Thompson, when I asked him about thimerosal, he stated that my daughter received all the same thimerosal-containing vaccines as your son, and she's doing just fine. Okay. Needless to say, I did not let him get away with such an unscientific statement in the N of 1 experiment he was evidently conducting in his own home. As my questions became more direct and pointed, CDC officials sought to look for ways to disqualify me from directly interacting with them as a scientific colleague. As I found out later, they secretly contacted the Department of Justice attorneys selected to oppose the petitioners, i.e. the children, in the omnibus autism proceedings of the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, in order to see if my son was indeed a petitioner in that program. They also did the same for Sally Bernard of Safe Minds, who was also asking them direct questions about vaccines and autism. In my son's case, we had filed for compensation under the NVICP and soon received a cease and desist letter from Ms. Deborah Tress, an attorney from the CDC, who claimed that I was using information from my investigation of the CDC as discovery for my son's case. Because discovery is not allowed for petitioners under the rules of the NVICP, Ms. Tress asked me to stop contacting CDC scientists stating my only recourse was to receive information was through the Freedom of Information Act, as well as through a single community liaison, Ms. Lorene Spencer. My attorney and I read the letter, had a good laugh, and then we sent a letter back saying that it was my right to contact any government official at any point in time. Ms. Tress shot back saying that it was my right to contact government officials, but that CDC officials outside of the FOIA office and Ms. Spencer would simply ignore any of my emails and voicemail messages. Thus, in early 2004, I started filing FOIA requests to the CDC at the rate of 1 per month, which is the maximum allowable number of requests that the CDC FOIA office would consider. Now, a little OCD kicked in, and 21 years later, I'm still filing FOIA requests at the rate of 1 per month. There's a post that group for me too. Very quickly, I had amassed quite a research library of emails, reports, memoranda, and other correspondences involving CDC scientists. When I had exhausted my own maximum number of filings, I started recruiting family members to also file FOIA requests to gain even more materials. At one point, I had a team of 5 separate volunteers, each who would file 1 request per month. CDC tried many tactics to discourage my efforts. Individuals who were giving up records for these requests would hide relevant documents that were the subject of my requests within stacks and stacks of irrelevant emails in an attempt to filibuster my efforts to learn the truth about investigations into vaccines and autism. In addition, I would receive invoices for as much as $250,000 per FOIA request for searching, copying, reviewing, and redacting documents that were subjects of my requests. Then in 2013, I received a very providential call from one Dr. William Thompson, the same epidemiologist who brusquely dismissed my concerns about vaccines and autism many years earlier. In this call and a series of exchanges that ensued over the next 10 months, Dr. Thompson was very different and in a way sought forgiveness for his role in the CDC's cover-up of the relationship between vaccines and autism. Bill Thompson released to me thousands of pages of emails, reports, and results of the studies he conducted in the Immunization Safety Office of the CDC. He also revealed the actual background documents showing that the CDC was indeed finding a statistically significant relationship between the thimerosal and neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, as well as the MMR vaccine and neurodevelopmental disorders. He also showed me to the proverbial front door of the CDC where I could directly request public use data sets in order to repeat the analyses of the CDC, which I did straight away for the MMR vaccine. This was the same data used for the DeStefano et al. 2004 pediatric study on the timing of the MMR vaccine and autism prevalence in a cohort of children in metropolitan Atlanta. When I received the data from CDC officials in 2014, within 15 minutes of starting the analysis, I saw that African American males receiving the MMR vaccine on time were over 3.5 times more likely to receive an autism diagnosis compared to those boys who received their first MMR vaccine after their 3rd birthday. I immediately called Bill, and his reaction was, "Oh, you found it." I asked him to explain further what did I find, and he described the whole saga where he found the same results on November 7th, 2001, and the co-authors of the study agonized over what to do with such a compelling finding. To Colleen Boyle, one of the senior authors of the paper, it was easy. Simply roll a bunch of blue recycle bins into the conference room and shred all evidence of the finding. It never happened. They never found it. They published something false in 2004 and moved on. But Bill secretly saved the information and over 10 years later shared it with me in a way that I found the result through my own analysis. It wasn't his sharing the results, it was me getting the data, directly through the CDC front door, analyzing the results, and sharing my own findings. That simple. That analysis was published in July 2014 in the journal Translational Neurodegeneration. However, the same day that Bill issued a statement through his attorney revealing the cover-up and supporting my paper, the journal decided to remove my paper from its website, saying initially that it was a threat to public health. Then changing the message to a trumped-up false charge that I had an undisclosed conflict of interest that compromised the original peer review process. Still looking for that conflict of interest. By October 6, 2014, the journal fully retracted the paper after a sham peer review process. I'll be talking more about the retraction in the last panel today, but the retraction changed the narrative of the CDC whistleblower story so the mainstream media could report on the flawed and fraudulent paper of Dr. Brian Hooker, rather than the original flawed and fraudulent paper of CDC scientists Frank DiStefano, Colleen Boyle, Marshall and Jurgen Alsop, and Tanya Bassin, and one Bill Thompson. Big Pharma had their out, and now the discussion could revert back to the conclusions of the 2004 IOM Immunization Safety Review Committee with a conflated message: no vaccines ever cause autism, despite the fact that only one vaccine, the MMR, and one vaccine component, the Marisol, have ever been studied as related to the US autism epidemic. And even those studies, as I saw before, were flawed and fraudulent. Since the CDC whistleblower story became public and the scientific establishment and the media tried to change the narrative from fraud within the CDC to a debunked researcher named Brian Hooker, I've continued to study vaccine adverse events, expanding to other chronic conditions related to vaccines, as well as the overall health of vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals. With Secretary Kennedy as head of HHS, we have a unique opportunity to investigate all of the sins of the past, holding accountable all of those individuals responsible for many cover-ups, not just this one, and clean up the mess left behind based on the lies about vaccines promulgated throughout society.
Yes.
Not only do we need to prevent this from happening in the future, but we need to take care of the many families that suffered and continue to suffer losses at the hands of CDC fraudsters, some that are still employed by the agency. As a parent of an adult son who sustained lifelong, easily preventable yet debilitating vaccine injuries, I feel that jail time is too good for these criminals who knowingly killed and made a generation of children. If jail time is as good as it gets, let's roll, and I'll break out the orange jumpsuits.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Hooker. Our next speaker is Jason Locasell, PhD. Dr. Locasell is an internationally recognized scholar and scientist who has made contributions to our understanding of metabolism and its impact on health. Beyond his scientific contributions, Dr. Locasell is deeply interested and engaged in academic and scientific freedom, advocating for transparency, accountability, and integrity in research institutions. His interests extend how science is funded, governed, and communicated to better serve discovery and the public good. Dr. Locasell graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Rutgers University with degrees in chemistry and physics, and earned his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he trained in chemistry and biological engineering. He moved into biomedical research during a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School, where he pioneered new technologies to study metabolism and made some foundational discoveries. He's held faculty appointments at Harvard Medical School, Cornell University, and Duke University, where he obtained tenure. He's currently founder and CEO of Locasell Research Group, LLC, and holds adjunct faculty appointments at North Carolina State University and Duke University. He's authored more than 200 scientific publications, contributed to major textbooks, and serves on editorial boards, including PLOS Biology. He has advised the National Institutes of Health in numerous capacities, as well as various philanthropic organizations and industry, where he's contributed to the founding and establishment of several biotech companies. He's considered a pioneer in the application of metabolomics, a technology used to study multiple aspects of metabolism at once, to study biology, leading newfound understanding of metabolic health. His discoveries, including defining one-carbon metabolism in cancer and healthy aging, elucidating the quantitative logic of glucose metabolism in health and cancer, and uncovering how diet and metabolism shape both metabolic pathways and the epigenome, have become foundational in several fields. He has for 7 consecutive years been recognized as one of the most highly cited researchers in the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilkinson.
Thanks, Justin. That's quite a kind introduction. Thank you to the MAHA Institute for the invitation and for the important work you're doing to foster open discussion. It's quite an honor to be here, especially among people who care so deeply about the integrity of science and the reform of its institutions. So Justin introduced me well, and I think with that introduction, I think my goal is not to brag about my accomplishments, but to make something clear that the critique I'm going to give about these scientific institutions does not come from the sidelines. It comes from someone who has had some success within these systems. But it's also from someone who's grown increasingly frustrated watching how deeply they have drifted from their original purpose. I think what was intended to be a public trust for biomedical research and training has become a massive industrial complex. Universities and their medical schools now operate less like places of medical knowledge and more like corporate holding companies. Revenue flows through hospital systems, largely government funded, and research grants, feeding an ever-expanding central administration within these medical centers. They are nonprofits. They enjoy generous tax exemptions and public subsidies. In some cases, upwards of 90% of their operating budget come directly from federal funding, mostly through the National Institute of Health. Yet they function as oligarchies, opaque, unaccountable, and shielded from scrutiny by layers of administration and the lawyers, consultants, and public relations staff that prioritize their institutional preservation over innovation. A small circle of elite medical schools, their affiliated hospitals, and the organizations they influence dominate the flow of research money. They and those who aspire to align with them not only control the money, but they also define what counts as the truth. These institutions are expected to be stewards of knowledge. Instead, they are captured, more focused on signaling virtue than upholding it. The result is a cartel of influence, where reputation among them replaces substance and politics takes precedence over truth. They operate as cultural and scientific gatekeepers, shaping narratives that protect institutional power rather than expanding human understanding. Countless scientists within these institutions find themselves trapped, compelled to conform and incentivized to pursue institutional approval over truth. Their bureaucracies grow, independence among scientists recedes, and the ideals that science was built upon, honesty, curiosity, rigor, and debate, are replaced by performance and control. The public senses this. People see the tuition bills, people see the unexpected charges from university hospitals, they see the financial strain from their taxes. They know that billions in federal funds are spent on research, yet they wonder exactly what comes from it. Public trust in research universities is low, not because the people reject knowledge, but because they see institutions that consume vast public resources while appearing more focused on image, politics, and profit than on truth. Yet, there's a way forward. As we speak, artificial intelligence is transforming how research is conducted, how learning occurs, and how knowledge is created and shared. At the same time, technological advances in the life sciences have enabled the rapid, increasingly automated acquisition of biological data. These tools are generating an unprecedented view of life. And this moment challenges universities to adapt, not to defend these legacy structures. And it's not a crisis to resist, as many universities currently are doing, but an opportunity to rebuild. The academic medical center must be reformed around its founding purpose, the pursuit of medical knowledge in service to the public good. The NIH now operates with a budget approaching $50 billion a year, and much of that funding directly flows into the university medical centers, sustaining not only their administrations, but the journals that we talked about, the associations, the professional organizations that all depend on them. With such concentration of money, the NIH has the power and the responsibility to influence how these institutions function, and to ensure that the system operates with transparency and accountability to the public that sustains it. The NIH should address how it allocates resources, funding meritorious research with portfolio diversification. It must not sustain the layers of bureaucracy that drain the very innovation that public investment is meant to support. Review should reward merit and not cronyism, not identity politics. Funding priorities must reflect the full spectrum of what truly matters for human health. Chronic disease, prevention, nutrition, toxicology, metabolism, physiology, all areas that have been vaccine injury, all areas that have been historically neglected from NIH funding and have been completely left aside at these medical centers. NIH funding should not only be what aligns with pharmaceutical interests or institutional trends. These academic medical centers are deeply ingrained. Their structures, incentives, and networks have evolved over decades, making reform from within them nearly impossible, and from outside, exceedingly difficult. That is why we must open science itself to genuine competition. NIH has the power to create new research institutions. The goal is not only to improve the existing institutions, but to create new ones that lead a true marketplace for scientific innovation. Research organizations that can stand aside and compete with entrenched medical centers. Funding should follow the best scientists and the most innovative ideas, not the institutions that control the narrative. Portable grants and NIH-supported programs can empower independent research organizations to participate fully in the national research enterprise. New institutions can be leaner, more agile, and explicitly merit-based, focused on discovery rather than administrative growth, and guided by transparency rather than bureaucracy. The NIH has the means to enable this transition, just as it once built the research infrastructure through large-scale funding and partnerships. It can now foster pluralism, supporting diverse models for discovery and training to share the principles of merit and openness. A competitive, merit-based marketplace for research funding would reward creativity, integrity, and impact rather than proximity to power. It would broaden participation in science, open new paths for young researchers, and renew a culture where excellence and not ideology determines success. If we build new accountable research institutions alongside the legacy system, science can once again become what it was meant to be, an enterprise for truth, creativity, and public service. The reckoning in higher education that we're seeing right now is not the end of an era. It's the beginning of a renewal. An opportunity to rebuild a system that rewards excellence and restores public trust in the institutions that shape our future. That is how we align science once again with its public purpose, to ensure that institutions built to serve medical knowledge remain worthy of it. Thank you again, MAHA Institute, for the chance to share.
Our last speaker for this Newsmakers Hour is James Lyons-Weiler, PhD. Dr. Lyons-Weiler has been publishing biomedical research for over 25 years, leading a movement to restore science as a tool for truth and public accountability. He founded and is editor-in-chief of the journal Science, Public Health Policy and the Law, a journal that had massive impact during the COVID-19 disinformation period, and then again during Secretary Kennedy's confirmation hearings. Dr. Lyons-Weiler is the president of the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, IPAC, and creator of IPAC EDU, an innovative educational platform that helps thousands of students, from teens to retirees, develop the skills and confidence to engage with science, medicine, and public policy. With over 60 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Lyons-Weiler has contributed to mission-first research in cancer biology, genomics, vaccine safety, neurodevelopment, autoimmunity, and environmental toxicology. He's best known for originating the concept of pathogenic priming, identifying systematic flaws in vaccine trial designs, and helping build the foundation for independent community research networks across the U.S. He's the author of The Environmental and Genetic Causes of Autism, Cures versus Profits, and Ebola, an Evolving Story, and is widely respected for his fearless, objective analysis and scientific integrity. His Substack, Popular Rationalism, reaches over 60,000 readers each week with clear-eyed, data-driven commentary. Grounded in philosophical empiricism and a fierce commitment to scientific integrity, Dr. Lyons-Weiler is known for his courage in the face of consensus pressure and his refusal to let politics or funding bias dictate what science is allowed to find. Please join in welcoming James Lyons-Weiler.
Wow, thank you, Justin. That was an amazing, nice introduction I wrote for myself. Amazing, thank you. Hey, can everyone just stand up for a minute and shake your lymphatics out a little bit? It's been a long morning, and I'm going to go on and on and on. You're going to really want to. Okay, sorry for the ladies that have to go to the restroom now. I want to ask you guys a question. Why are we here today? We're here today because the people that have had control of these institutions that you've heard about from our past speakers, the NIH, the HHS, and so on, they've lost their way. They've lost track of the fact that we have a sacred intergenerational contract of responsibility to our children, our grandchildren, and to future generations. What kind of world are we going to hand the next generation and 7 generations on? Mark Skidmore, a good friend of mine, a colleague, I have to issue a small citation, a correction. There are not 2 kinds of reality, right? There's one kind of reality, and the battle is not just regulatory capture, it's epistemic capture. Empirical research only works if we all agree that we do not know something. If you start making a knowledge claim that's not based on empirical research, and then you go along and find all the positive confirming instances that you can find, you're actually doing the kind of science that the Austrian school decided was the way that you should do science, which Nazi Germany just loved, literally. And Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, worked overtime, writing book after book after book. You want to fix science in the United States of America? Every single science degree in every major institution should require readings from Karl Popper. Every last one. If we do that, then we will have done a good thing to the future generations and the kind of world we're building. If you think that there's a monolith of corruption, there's not. Corruption has this way of popping up here and there. In corporations, the science that has to be done is the one that makes the product look safe and effective. It's not just vaccines. That's the science that has to be done. We have to rewrite the rules of ethical capitalism in the United States so that they don't answer to the investors only on what data they're allowed to bring forward. You can't publish that. It's going to hurt our investors. It's actually considered unethical for them to be charitable to humanity. This is confusing to me, right? I want to say that I'm going to use broad brushstrokes because there's a timer somewhere, and I don't want to go over time. I don't want to say that I'm against all corporations. I'm not. And I know there are many, many ethical corporations. But in universities, corruption pops up in the form of putting forward the best results that you have because you're most likely to get funding. It's the most natural thing you're going to do. But they have this problem called the circular file problem where the negative results are never published, so we really don't know what's not known. I used to run a podcast, What We Do Not Know Yet, WWNYK. It sounds like a television station or a radio station, right? I mean, it's so important that we win this war over what we know and what we don't know and how we go about knowing things. I've dedicated the rest of my life to this, no matter what it costs me. So if you're at a university and you're attracting, if you're a senior faculty member or administration, you're attracting young people because they happen to know the newest tech. They just come out of the graduate school training, they've got the latest and greatest ideas. And you pull them under your umbrella and then you steal their ideas and steal credit for it, and then you go off and you get yourself tenure. You're part of the problem, and you know who you are. I've seen those guys in action. Those guys are the kinds of people that these complex systems actually select for. I call them creatures with too many elbows, if you know what I mean. Anybody know what elbows up means in Canada? These guys have elbows everywhere. And we know them by the names of like Anthony Fauci, right? Yeah, on my tombstone, I want, he was the anti-Fauci. I really do, I want that. Make a record of that, okay? It's not hard to do what's right. Just follow that guy and then do the opposite. Seinfeld, okay? Just do the opposite. They had an ethical duty to protect the nation's investment in molecular biology, of course, because hundreds of millions of dollars went into that. And then they said, let's call it translational research, time to get that investment back in the form of medicines that are actually going to help people feel better and be healthier. But somewhere along the way, the life-savingness, and somewhere along the way, the fact that medicines that make people sick tend to lead to more medicines in market that make people sick, that tend to make more medicines that lead to market that make people sick, kind of took hold of us. That's what's happened. In medicine itself, you've got these conflicts of interest, for-profit, not-for-profit. We just heard about those complex entanglements. This trip to Washington, I've been back and forth quite a few times now. I've had no fewer than, and no insult to anybody here who made these approaches, but no fewer than 4 approaches for funding to me from a corporation to help them because they know how close I am to Secretary Kennedy. And each time I decline, and I say because I can't pick the winners, I have to have a clear head. Most likely, one day I'll have my hand on a Bible swearing that I didn't take any money for the way that I'm working with the Secretary and his team, and that I don't have a conflict of interest. I do have a conflict of interest to report today, and I didn't hear any of you guys say whether you did or not, so I'm going to call you out on that. But I run the journal Science Public Health Policy in the law, which was cited twice during Mr. Kennedy's confirmation hearings. And there's a little bit of revenue that comes into my life that way. I'm not sure exactly what percentage goes to what. I tend to reinvest in my little company, but I don't think anybody can disagree with most of what I just said, right? We've seen tobacco science. Remember tobacco science. It's how you fake the data, make the product look safe, and deny, deny, deny. What about fen-phen? We've heard Vioxx twice. But it's not just medicines and those kinds of consumer products. It's also big chem, which we're really not supposed to talk about today. We're not supposed to talk about ExxonMobil and the MTBE leaks, or the online oil pits in Ecuador, or the unfettered sale of friable plastics. These are that are making people sick, that don't deserve to be sick, so the corporation can make some easier money. But none of these problems, including vaccines, by the way, are solved by science just being a self-correcting process. That's a myth. If you think about the big controversies that Paul talked about and others, they were solved in court. They were solved with millions of dollars and both sides producing evidence and some judge somewhere saying, or jury saying, okay, we're going to award you. That's not science. Do we want litigation? Do we want to litigate science? And we're going to hear about retraction, but I'm going to tell you, retraction puts the scientist in a very bad situation because it comes with stigma. Retraction of your study means that you did something wrong. So what the journals have decided to do is we're not going to tell you what you did wrong. We're simply going to retract it and say there's some methodological thing, and you know, somebody disagreed with your results. The stigma is still there because nobody knows the story. Oh, you got a paper retracted. Well, what does that really mean? We can't then, as scientists, sue the journal and then hold up that paper and say, right, Jason? Look at this paper that I had to, it's so bad, I had to sue the journal to keep it in the pages. It's unimaginably bad, the stigma that would happen to the scientists that way. So with hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees and so on, great. That's not science. But what are we allowed to question and who controls it? To me, science is for knowing things. It's a way of knowing. I think we should be allowed to question everything. If there's social stigma, well, isn't that what science always did, was resolve social differences? Isn't science one of the gatekeepers on tyranny? So that if there's something that's changing the hormonal development of our children, we should be allowed to talk about it and still embrace them as our children, without castigation and without all this stigma that comes along with controversy. And I want to know who in medical research decided that controversy into science was a bad thing, right? I mean, my gosh, if you wrote a paper that was controversial in biology, you just hit it. You're going to be in Science News. It's a controversial thing. They debate, you know. But in medicine, now all of a sudden, it's, oh, that's a problem. You question carcinogens in food, go for it. If you reduce emissions from diesel near schools, go for it. These are heroes, right? If you're going to question mercury, aluminum, and unsafe proteins in vaccines, all of a sudden, after a long career of fighting environmental toxins or doing chemical research or environmental biology and ecology and evolution, all of a sudden you're a crazy person? How does that work? I mean, that's just propaganda-based messaging that's very effective, and we learned it from the CIA about how to shut down social movements. They failed. They have failed. Not only have we won, but they have failed. So, I'm not offering problem after problem, but I do have to point to de-weaponization of science as the priority. We can understand it. We've got all the catalogs. We've got the books written. We've got the editorials. We've got the blogs. We've got the podcasts. We've got the stories. We need to shift towards de-weaponization of science, and we know how to do that. We know that we have attorney generals that are looking at 28 journals. Attorney general in the United States have been handed a list of 28 papers that were wrongfully retracted by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., our secretary.
Yay.
The former Attorney General told the American Academy of Physicians and Surgeons last month that all of those journals have now been put on notice. All of them. But there's someone I want to call out. If you're from the press, I want you to look at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, their website, and tell me that they are not committing fraud by telling every patient's parent that aluminum in vaccines is safe. That's just outright fraud. It's fraud in advertising. It's willful deception, all of it. You know, he doesn't tell, Paul Walker does not tell the public that 0.03% of the aluminum that you ingest goes all the way through your body without ever causing a problem. You don't even make it to the bloodstream. But he says you're going to get more aluminum from food and water and anything made of water than you'd ever get from vaccines. It took IPAC, which has this tiny, tiny little budget, to publish the fact that babies on the first day of life get between 14 and 20 times the amount of aluminum injected into their body that any adult would ever get from any other vaccine. 20 times? What are we doing to our children? Hepatitis B. We also educated the world in a series of publications that aluminum from food is not absorbed nearly as much as that, so we don't have to look at that as a model. It's a wrong model. They had control of all of these agencies, and they have lost control. While they had control, they could have fixed it. They can never be allowed back again. Because it wasn't enough for them to have 95% vaccine coverage and cash their checks, or 97 or 98%. They had to go for the lie of 100%. vaccine coverage was necessary. And it wasn't enough for them to make those profits. They actually had to castigate and harm people that were speaking out against vaccine injury and alerting people of the possibility, doing the job of the federal government about informed consent, to the point where a bioethicist from New York University a few years ago, before COVID, actually made the announcement that they were at war with anti-vaxxers, so it was okay for them to do anything they wanted to do to us. They announced a civil war in the United States of America. I'm not going to mention his name because, please, I'm not going to mention his name because I'm sure he has family. And I'm sure he's kind to his family. With a C. Okay. But history tells us, story after story after story, that science is not going to fix itself. It takes someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's going to find it. And I want to close with the promise and the challenge that it is not up to the panelists here and the speakers today, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. alone. It is not up to us to make sure that when government funds science and it's published, it's actually science, not fraud. It is up to every human being in these great United States of America to watchdog science, to doubt science, to be skeptical of science, to double check things, and to write letters to editors of journals if you find a ridiculous study and say, how did you publish this? Don't ask for retraction, ask for discourse. Because through discourse, if the journal will publish discourse, then let society, let the scientific community decide. Thank you for your attention. Let's have a great day.